It is my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Dr. Erin Marcus. She holds the distinguished position of Associate Professor of Clinical Medicine in the Division of General Internal Medicine at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine. Dr. Marcus received her MD degree at UMass Worcester. She then completed residency at Georgetown University Hospital in Washington, D.C. She holds the titles of Associate Program Director for our Internal Medicine Residency Program and Director of the Academic Internal Medicine Primary Care Clinic at Jackson Memorial Hospital. Additionally, she spearheaded the development of the program's ambulatory didactic curriculum. Her University of Miami Master of Public Health thesis focused on seafood consumption among patients in the Jackson Medicine Clinic. She has also authored 4 chapters for Up to Date on marine toxins and jellyfish stings. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Erin Marcus as she gives an excellent presentation titled, Don't Go Fish, the Perils of Seafood.
Thank you, Reggie. Okay, so my topic is sort of one-sided. It's talking about the perils of seafood, and I was asked to focus more on marine toxins, although there are other conditions that you can get from seafood that I'll briefly mention. Okay, so in my talk, I'm going to give a brief overview of the benefits of seafood consumption, since I don't want this to be totally one-sided. I'm going to talk about the epidemiology of recent marine toxin outbreaks and some of the clinical findings that you'll see with different marine toxin-associated illness. I'm going to briefly review treatment of marine toxin syndromes and talk about some other environmental risks. And hopefully by the end of my talk, you won't feel like the guy in this cartoon. Okay, so this is my one slide on the benefits of seafood consumption. You should know that in the United States, on average, the average U.S. citizen or U.S. resident consumes 15 pounds of seafood annually, it's been estimated. We're behind other nations on this. It's actually behind poultry, beef, pork, peanuts, and eggs as a protein source. And the benefits of eating fish seem to stem from certain essential amino acids, which we don't produce on our own, which are EPA and also DHA, which you can also get from eating seaweed, by the way. The best types of fish for this are fatty cold water fish like salmon, mackerel, tuna, herring, and sardines. The American Heart Association recommends that you eat 2 servings on average per week because of the association with reduction in coronary disease. And also the American College of OBGYN recommends that pregnant women eat 2 to 3 servings a week. They specifically recommend fish that are low in mercury, such as, again over here, salmon, cod, etc. There are some concerns about fish that have higher mercury content, such as swordfish and certain types of tuna and orange roughy. So these should be avoided by pregnant women, and these are the better choice. And that's from the ACOG website. Okay, in terms of fish-borne disease outbreaks, this is from a recent article from the CDC. There were 250,000 reported cases of fish-related disease in 7 years prior to 2015. You should know that these illnesses tend to be, often they're self-limited and they don't go reported. Probably the vast majority do not go reported. There were 857 outbreaks reported to health authorities, resulting in 359 hospitalizations and 4 deaths in that time period. And the 2 biggest states for this were Hawaii, which accounted for more than a quarter of outbreaks, and that is a much smaller state than we are, and also Florida. In 3/4 of these reported cases, there were etiologies confirmed for scombroid, which I'll talk about in a minute, Salmonella, which I'm not going to really talk about much because we're focusing on marine toxins, and cigatoxin. Salmonella accounted for 31% of the hospitalizations, as did cigatoxin. However, norovirus, which is highly infectious, and Salmonella caused the biggest outbreaks. So with things like cigatoxin or Scombroid, those were more sort of, a couple clusters of a few people at a time. This is also from the slide. You can see that the numbers haven't necessarily increased over the past decade or so, and there are a fair number of outbreaks that were unknown, but were somehow linked to, fish. The most common types of fish for known fish-related disease were tuna, which was more associated with scombroid toxicity, mahi-mahi, which is also sold as dolphin fish. Often that was associated with scombroid toxicity, and then grouper, which actually was most commonly associated with cigatoxin. Okay, so scombroid. So this is a patient that I saw a few years ago, actually at the UMHC practice, but back when general internal medicine was at UMHC. This was a female employee of UM who actually ate at the cafeteria. She had a very good meal of mahi-mahi, and then shortly after eating, she felt very flushed, very itchy. She had this red rash. She felt that she was in a lot of distress. She had palpitations. She thought she was having an allergic reaction. She came right up to us, but she had never had a fish allergy before. And we gave her diphenhydramine, and it resolved very quickly. The next week, a UM physician had the exact same syndrome, ate at the cafeteria downstairs. I'm not going to say who this person is, but this person can volunteer themselves if they want. And came right up, felt very in distress, had a rash here, erythematous, urticarial, but not wheals, and palpitations, low blood pressure, and again, resolved with IV diphenhydramine. So this is scombroid toxicity. So why does this occur? So it's not a seasonal condition. You tend to see it occurs because of metabolism of the histidine that naturally occurs on the surface of fish by bacteria, and the conversion into histamine. So you're basically getting a bolus of histamine. So you don't have an allergy, but you're getting you have an allergic type reaction. It's seen on darker meat fish, commonly mahi-mahi, which is at the top. It's also called dolphin fish, bluefish, amberjack, swordfish. It can occur with cheese also. And here you see the histidine being decarboxylated into histamine. Histidine is just naturally there on the fish surface. And this could occur anywhere. This could occur out at sea. If the fish is not refrigerated for a couple of hours, say when the fishermen are out at sea, even if they then refrigerate it and then sell it, and the restaurant or store maintains it properly, you could still have levels of histamine that could cause these symptoms. As with other marine toxins, cooking and heat and freezing do not break down the histamine. So this is not like an infectious disease where you cook the food and the bacteria is broken down. And again, the patients often have what seems like an allergic reaction. It can be more severe in people who are older, who have cardiovascular disease, who have asthma. But generally, it resolves within a few hours. People, you can have varying degrees of intensity of the symptoms. If the person already is taking antihistamines, say they have seasonal allergies, they may not have much in the way of symptoms. But people who are on INH, that happens to block histaminase in the gut, and they may have more of a reaction. So also, it's good to, you may have a patient who may say, oh, I ate that and I had this reaction, but maybe they didn't really have a fish allergy. Maybe they just were exposed to scombroid. Okay, so the take-home point, this is not a good idea. If the chef says that you should help him, clean out the salmon that he has left over. Okay, so Guitarra. So this is a fisherman in his 50s. He went fishing. He ate some grouper that he caught, and then a couple hours later, he suddenly begins developing GI symptoms, terrible cramps, vomiting, diarrhea. Along with this, he has bradycardia and low blood pressure. And then he also has this weird perioral numbness and tingling in this unpleasant tingling in his arms. And on exam, he's bradycardic, low blood pressure, abdomen's, diffusely tender, and EKG shows sinus brady. And by happenstance, his fishing buddy, who also ate the fish, has the same symptoms. This is Cigatera, okay? South Florida and also the Pacific are hotspots for this. These are some of this is actually a poster that was created by the Department of Health. And you can see here some of the fish that are, likely to carry this. This is hogfish, grouper, barracuda, red snapper. And actually, Cigatera was described many centuries ago. Actually, Captain James Cook, who was in the South Pacific, described it. And he said, everyone who had eaten of these fish were seized with violent pains in the head and limbs. And you can see. But then they all recovered, except that one of their animals that also ate the fish died. So, okay. Okay, Cigatera is created by a dinoflagellate called Gambierdiscus. You can see it up here. And it creates this toxin. These single-celled organisms live around coral reefs in warm areas. So this is not something generally that you'll see in fish caught in a temperate climate. We see this more in the tropics and subtropics. The herbivorous fish like this eat the dinoflagellates, and then the larger fish, such as barracuda, the more aggressive fish, then consume the smaller fish and concentrate the organs. Concentrate the toxin in their organs. It's a heat-resistant neurotoxin. So, you can use excellent hygiene in preparing this fish and cook it, and yet the neurotoxin will persist. And basically, the toxin opens voltage-dependent sodium channels and causes membrane depolarization. Again, initially, you will see GI symptoms, often with the cardiovascular symptoms, and then a little bit later on, you'll see neurologic symptoms. And the problem is that the neurologic symptoms can last months or even years. There's this very classic finding, which are temperature-related dysesthesias, or also called cold allodynia, where people may feel very uncomfortable cold sensation when something touches them. They can also even lead to neuropsychological symptoms. And we actually have quite a wealth of knowledge here at University of Miami on this. Dr. Ayar in neurology, Dr. Kathy Schrank, and Richard Weissman have written a lot about this, since a lot of these cases are seen in the emergency department and then discharged. But I have had some cases admitted to my service at Jackson with this. So the treatment, unfortunately, there's no serum assay, first of all, in terms of diagnosis. There are some assays looking at the fish, but that takes a little while to be processed. So really the treatment is supportive therapy with IV hydration to maintain blood pressure. You want to give atropine. You may give atropine for the bradycardia, diphenhydramine for the pruritus. Often these patients will have pruritus without a rash. Generally, it's felt we should avoid anti-motility agents because the diarrhea is thought to be a process whereby the patient is getting rid of the toxin. If the patient is hemodynamically stable, there have been some small studies looking at mannitol to reduce the risk of later neurologic symptoms by reducing neuronal edema. For long-term neurologic symptoms, gabapentin, amitriptyline, pregabalin, fluoxetine have been used. And also, interestingly, in the first 6 months, there has been sort of this phenomenon where if people eat fish again, or drink alcohol, or eat nuts, or overexert themselves, they may have a recurrence of some of the neurologic symptoms. The symptoms of ciguatera can be actually spread sexually, so men are advised to use condoms while they are symptomatic. It's also important to note, ciguatera is not an infectious disease, okay? You don't develop an immunity to it, and actually there's some studies suggesting that subsequent episodes may be more intense. And actually some of the patients I've seen were fishermen who knew what they had, and they'd had it before, and they came to the hospital this time because their symptoms were much more intense. There recently was a study a couple of years ago, a survey of people with recreational fishing licenses in Miami-Dade and Monroe counties, which are two of the hot spots, asking people if they'd had these symptoms. And there were a fair number of people who reported symptoms. They estimated the prevalence in Miami-Dade County at 1 in 100,000 people. Interestingly, more than half of the people who had had symptoms consistent with ciguatera said they had not gone to seek medical attention. So this is considered to be a very underreported condition. But it's out there, and if you work in Miami, there's a good chance you'll see it. There's a good chance you could be exposed to it. Okay, so in terms of prevention, about a year and a half ago, NOAA was doing the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration was doing research on this fluorescent receptor binding assay called CTOX. It's important to try to educate your patients about the types of fish that they should avoid. It's actually illegal to sell barracuda commercially in Miami-Dade. And then, there's certain fish, so moray eel, barracuda, grouper, red snapper, which you talked about, amberjack. This is actually amberjack. Those are huge fish that actually do go up north. Sometimes people off of North Carolina will catch them. It's interesting. So when I was preparing this lecture, I thought it would be interesting to I just Googled yummy barracuda recipes, wondering if people eat barracuda because some people say barracuda is quite delicious, although I've never partaken of it. And I came up on actually this food blog. Actually, this was from Nigeria. This person was writing about how they had delicious barracuda. And then this was from a cooking.com website. Somebody sent in this recipe for barracuda, and they did have this little disclaimer that this recipe has not been tested for home use. So, but unfortunately, even if you're super careful and you know about the type of fish that you should avoid, there's this problem, which is often fish is mislabeled. Okay, so this is a fun little cartoon that is made up, but the reality is that there's also a lot of fish fraud. Okay, so you may not be getting what you think you're getting. And actually, this is an organization called Oceana, which is an ocean advocacy group. They did DNA analysis of 1,200 samples all around the country. Actually, so there was an article in the Miami Herald that said, our fish fraud rivaled our Medicare fraud. And everybody knows that our region, not us, but our region is number one in Medicare fraud. Actually, we're not number one in fish fraud. Southern California is. It was 50% of the fish was mislabeled there. The worst places were sushi joints. 74% of the fish at sushi joints was mislabeled. So buyer beware. Your safest going to the grocery store and making it yourself, but still there is a fair amount of mislabeling. Snapper, they said, and tuna were the most common. So, and actually, under the previous administration, the Department of Justice and NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, got together and actually did investigations into this. And there was a company here in Miami which was mislabeling trout from Chile as salmon and selling it for a much higher price, and they were actually prosecuted. However, the new head of NOAA is a businessman who sells their weather data, so I don't know how interested they still are in that. But so if that's the case, though, there is this cartoon: give a man a fish, feed him for a day, teach a man to sue, he'll eat for a lifetime. So I actually periodically get emails because I wrote this chapter and up to date from lawyers around the country who are trying to sue various restaurants because their clients had got contracted Ciguatera. So anyway, okay. So those are two of the big reed toxins that you're likely to see. Next, I'm going to talk about some things that have been in the news recently. You've probably heard about the terrible red tide that occurred over the summer mostly on the Gulf Coast. There was a little bit at one point. They said that there was some red tide affecting Broward and Dade County. But this was basically, this is well known. This is a red tide caused by brevetoxin, which is created by these, these little organisms called Cardia brevis, which create the red tide. Makes brevetoxin, which increases sodium ion channel permeability. And it also inhibits cathepsins, which are lysosomal proteinases found in phagocytes. It basically can cause two clinical symptoms. One is if you eat it, you can have GI distress and then neurologic symptoms. Okay, so you should not be eating this fish. And you can see there were just massive, it was horrible, massive fish kills, dolphins, etc., mostly on the Gulf Coast. But the other thing that did affect people was inhalation. So aerosolized red tide can cause a respiratory symptom, and a lot of also rhinorrhea, bronchoconstriction. Actually, the Florida Department of Health did note that there was an increase in emergency visits, mostly on the Gulf Coast, related to exposure. However, they also have a slide saying that on their website saying that the percentage of ER respiratory visits was minimally higher compared with other years. Now, it would be interesting to look at some of the specific counties. I mean, they threw in Miami-Dade County and Broward, which supposedly there was some red tide here, but really it wasn't as prevalent as in like Collier County or some of those other counties. So it'd be interesting. They don't present the individual data for those counties. Okay, the other toxin that you may have heard about was cyanobacteria, and this actually affected the area, I believe, around the it was the St. Lucie River north of us on the Atlantic coast. Okay, this is basically sort of pond scum. Okay, it's blue-green bacteria that support themselves through photosynthesis. They live symbiotically with plants and fungi, and they form these blooms. They can form in fresh water and then go out to salt water. And there's a lot of concern that this is due to runoff from the sugar industry and all the phosphorus, as well as our people's yards. Unfortunately, there is very sparse data on this on the Department of Health website. And really what's there is sort of just reassuring people, telling people, don't let your dog drink this water, but saying, well, that we don't really have good data proving this or proving any effect. The concern is that cyanobacteria do produce toxins. There's these microcystins, which concentrate in the liver, and also there's beta-methylaminoalanine, which is a neurotoxic amino acid, and there's some concern about an association with ALS. There was a geographic study looking at tried to find an association between non-alcoholic liver disease mortality and bloom exposure. Actually, this was done by some people here, by Dr. Zhang and colleagues here at UM. But again, this is just sort of geographic associations, and it's hard to sort of pinpoint concrete effects. And there was an increase in number of calls to Florida Poison Control among people who were concerned about exposure, but at this point, we don't really know what the long-term effects of exposure to this algae has been. Okay, so those are the things that we clinically are likely to be concerned about. So I'm going to talk about a few, since I was asked to talk about marine toxins, I'm going to talk about a few others. This is sort of an interesting one, tetrodotoxin. You may have heard about this. I remember hearing about this in medical school physiology because this is a very potent neurotoxin that binds sodium channels in the axon and blocks sodium influx. It can act on vascular smooth muscle, skeletal muscle. It's extremely toxic. And within 45 minutes, the person can start to have neurologic symptoms, hypotension, generalized paralysis, respiratory failure. The treatment is supportive. There may be a role for anticholinesterases, and intestinal lavage can be performed if you catch the person early. So it comes from these cute little pufferfish, which, when threatened, turn into these. Now, in Japan, there is a delicacy called fugu, which is prepared by licensed chefs who have been trained to identify the type of pufferfish and serve only the part that is minimally toxic, and supposedly it gives the person a nice aura in their mouth, a tingling aura. Interestingly, I don't know if anybody saw this, but there was a BBC documentary in which they observed that dolphins deliberately get high on pufferfish nerve toxin, and they pass the pufferfish around and then kind of chill out. I thought that was kind of amusing. But it is a very potent toxin, and it almost killed James Bond in Dr. No, just so you know. And there was this great quotation that Ian Fleming wrote. He said, "It was a bright chap at the School of Tropical Medicine who came up with it. The drug was Fugu poison. The Japanese use it for committing suicide. It comes from the sex organs of Japanese globefish. Trust the Russians to use something no one's ever heard of." So there was a Russian villainess who almost killed James Bond with this. I thought that was an interesting little tidbit. Okay, so paralytic shellfish poisoning is also associated with red tide, but up in more temperate regions. Okay, and periodically the shellfish banks will be closed up in Maine and up on the northeast and the northwest. And this is due to Saxi toxin, which blocks sodium ion channels. It affects shellfish because shellfish filter water freely. They're great for cleaning the ocean, cleaning harbors, but they also take in a lot of toxins. Mussels and clams are the riskiest. Non-commercially harvested Alaskan shellfish are the most dangerous, but commercial Alaskan shellfish are routinely monitored for this. And this can cause rapid neurologic dysfunction, even respiratory failure, and actually the case fatality rate is 12%. Now, if you survive this, your symptoms hopefully will resolve within a few days. Okay, diarrheal shellfish poisoning. This is due to ocadaic acid, which is a heat. Again, the previous were due to a heat-stable toxin, which inhibits phosphorylation. Acutely, it can cause GI symptoms. Again, it usually resolves within 2 or 3 days. But there's been concern about ocadaic acid acting as a tumor promoter, and some have speculated association between mussel consumption and possibly colorectal cancer, because it's been found that it actually promotes growth of cells in gastric and colon epithelial cell lines. Okay, and then amnesic shellfish poisoning also this actually is due to another heat-stable toxin called domoic acid, produced by phytoplankton in colder areas. There was an outbreak off the coast of Prince Edward Island. It's been detected in California Dungeness crab, although, again, this is why we monitor seafood. It's, again, associated with diarrhea, cramps, and then neurologic deficits, and survivors may have anterograde short-term memory deficits. There are hundreds of other marine toxins. More commonly, actually, clinicians are going to see infectious agents, such as Salmonella. Again, there you may have more of a septic picture. The person may look febrile. And again, this is heat sensitive, so you cook the fish well. You hopefully have good handling of the fish. Also, norovirus, which is extremely contagious, can cause a fish-related disease. But again, you're going to have more of a septic type of pattern, a toxic type pattern. But that's not all, folks. So unfortunately, we as humans have dumped a lot of our garbage into the ocean, and there's a lot of concern that's been growing about the health effects of all this. So it's been observed for a while that the metabolites of antidepressants, of various hormones, et cetera, that humans take ends up in the oceans and in the food supply. But more recently, there's been a lot of concern about plastics, both in terms of its effects on marine life and in terms of concern about our getting microplastics in our food by eating fish. The UN actually published a report on this recently. Microplastics are considered plastic that's less than 5 millimeters. And remember, plastic gets dumped in the ocean and then over time it breaks down. Nanoplastics are less than 100 nanometers. And the other thing is, aside from the plastics themselves, these plastics also adsorb and absorb various toxins. Now, in fish, the GI tract is usually where these plastics accumulate, and usually that is removed prior to eating. So the risk is it's more of a concern with bivalves and then small fish that you eat whole. The UN report gave a worst case estimate that if you ate a 225-gram portion of mussels, you were ingesting 7 micrograms of plastic. But they point out that they said there's no methods available for the observation and quantification of nanoplastics in aquatic environments and organisms, and they say there are significant knowledge gaps at the present time. So we don't really know about the long-term implications of this. So the take-home points. Okay, so as you saw, a thorough history is really important to ascertain the diagnosis. We don't have a lot of serum assays for these marine toxins. It's really important to get a good history. I would recommend trying to avoid eating fish brains, guts, liver, kidneys, and gonads, since that is where these toxins tend to accumulate. You should also know, though, that even if you're careful, fish fraud is common. As with all food, you should use good hygiene, cook it to try to avoid salmonella and norovirus. Keep in mind that what seems like a fish allergy may be due to scabroid. And you should try to report, actually these diseases are reportable. You should report them to the Department of Health. This is the number. And also the Florida Poison Control Line. And the staff there actually can be of great help. Dr. Weissman's a great expert on this. And also just try to avoid using single-use plastic, since often it ends up in the ocean. So, okay, the questions.
That was great, Dr. Marcus. Thank you very much. Dr. Martin.
Okay, Erin,
Yeah.
this was fantastic. Can I ask you, is there much information about the health issues related to eating farmed fish? For instance, tilapia are
Yeah.
raised in a stew of antibiotics, typically in Asia. Same with farmed salmon. And it would seem to me that there's probably more cumulative risk in eating farmed fish than taking a chance to
With wild fish? I think I have seen things, if you look at that UN report, in terms of microplastics. I'm not sure that that's the case. I mean, I know farmed fish are exposed to antibiotics and to, there is some concern about microplastics in them too, but there's so much plastic in the ocean, even in areas that humans haven't really. It was interesting. I went to a talk last week over at Rasmus, and there was an explorer who dove in an area where humans had never dove before and found all this plastic just at the bottom of the ocean. So I don't know that, say, wild salmon is any safer than farmed salmon, unfortunately, in that. And maybe in terms of antibiotics, but in terms of microplastics. I can't really say.
Dr. Gardner?
So, Dr. Marcus, with this multitude of information and expertise that you clearly accumulated and shared with us, what fish do you eat?
Well, first of all, okay, it's important in terms of the cardiovascular benefits, right? It's the fatty, it's the cold water fatty fish. So it's something like salmon, it's something like cod. When I go up to Boston, I go to Legal Seafoods because they have a really tight quality control operation there that they've used to market themselves. I mean, I love clam chowder, and I like going to Garcia's and getting the sandwich. You know, there's a lot of risks in life. I mean, I drive a car in Miami, which is probably more of an immediate risk, right, than the long-term risk of this. So, but I have cut down, especially with this microplastics. I have cut back on my consumption, and the shellfish, that's concerning. I've cut back on the fish consumption, but you can also get some of this benefit from. Actually, my daughter is a vegan, and you can get some of this benefit through. There are these algae supplements that take the seaweed and get the essential fatty acids that way. But yeah. I didn't talk about mercury. Yeah, I mean I briefly mentioned that in I think the very first slide where ACOG recommends that swordfish, which I used to eat a lot of, which is very tasty. It apparently has high levels of mercury. There are certain fish that concentrated swordfish, orange roughy. I think this is more. It's especially a concern, I think, for women of childbearing age, for children. I wouldn't give if I had a little kid, I wouldn't give him or her swordfish, for example. But I don't know. Once you get to be middle-aged, you've already been exposed. So
my source here is actually Vice News, right? One of the things again that I saw was that the concern for microplastics is not just in fish, but also in birds and other marine life. And part of the concern is actually embryology and development. And we're finding like a lot of the birds die out early, or have you run across anything along those concerns, right? That the toxins may not just be transmitted directly to humans, but also to other parts of the chain of life that we depend on, right? That are essential to fertilization and pollination and just sort of the whole thing.
I mean, that's certainly a concern. I wasn't really researching that for this because this was focusing on fish, but there's certainly, there's been all sorts of, you can find lots of photos of birds with just, they open it up and it just has all this plastic inside it. And, that's certainly a concern. And there's another concern, which is the rapid crash of the insect population. You've probably read about in Puerto Rico. That we need insects to pollinate our food. And
just so I'm safe, because I'm a busy woman. How about canned tuna? Can I eat canned tuna? Plans.
Sorry? Oh, the canned tuna? Sure. This is why. Has everybody read Michael Lewis's book, The Fifth Risk? It's a great book. It's really a great book about the unglamorous things that our federal government does for us, one of which is inspect things like the fish supply, and this is why you need a functioning federal government. I try not to be political, but there's some concern about, I guess, mercury toxicity, but, unless you're planning on getting pregnant soon, I think it's okay. Okay.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Marcus.
Thank you.
In terms of keeping kosher, you have